Probably one of the most popular advocates for the scientific accuracy of Job was Henry M. Morris. Morris was one of the founders of the Creation Research Society and the Institute for Creation Research, and is considered by many to be the father of modern creation science. Creation science, or creationism, is a branch of apologetics which argues that the earth and entire universe is no more than a few thousand years old, based upon a literal reading of the biblical text. Morris published a Christian best-selling book in 1988 titled The Remarkable Record of Job, in which he argued for the many amazing scientific insights found in the biblical epic. Many other apologists since have picked up Morris's arguments and are convinced the Book of Job reveals details about modern science, which provides evidence of its ultimate divine authorship. For example, Morris and his apologetic disciples have suggested various verses in the Book of Job seem to describe the basics of the Earth's hydrologic system, including evaporation and cloud formation, as well as the enormously important relationship between water and air for controlling the Earth's weather. In his book, Morris points out that Job chapter 28, verses 24 through 27, seems to show knowledge of this relationship. For he looketh to the ends of the earth, and seeth under the whole heaven, to make the weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure. When he made a decree for the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder, then did he see it, and declare it. He prepared it, yea, and searched it out. Unless by divine inspiration, point out apologists like Morris, how could the author of Job have known not only that water had weight, but also air? Until 1640, no one had any scientific evidence that air had weight. But Evangelista Torricelli, an Italian mathematician, invented an instrument to measure atmospheric pressure, the barometer. We now know that air weighs approximately 15 pounds per square inch at sea level. Air indeed has weight, just as the Book of Job proclaims. However, when apologists make such a proclamation, they are forcing into the text an interpretation far beyond what the verse itself reasonably allows. While the passage speaks of weight, it is specifically speaking of wind, not just air generically. And while anything with mass has weight, we specifically feel a sensation of air's weight when the wind blows. That is probably what was meant by Job 28:24. The author was writing about the force of air as it feels against the body, as it sways trees and blows across the desert sands. There is nothing in the text to suggest he actually understood atmospheric pressure, or that all mass, including air, has weight, as a scientific discovery. Having asserted that Job 28 evidenced knowledge of the weight of the winds, apologists like Morris go on to state that Job 36, verses 27 and 28, seem to describe the basics of evaporation and condensation. Morris asks, "Water weighs much more than air, so how is it retained in the sky at all? Here is how. He maketh small the drops of water, they pour down rain according to the vapor thereof, which the clouds do drop, and distill upon man abundantly." Water is converted by solar energy into the vapor state. Since water vapor is lighter than air, the wind can first elevate, then transport the water from the oceans to the lands where it is needed. There, under the right conditions, the vapor can condense around dust particles, salt particles, or other nuclei of condensation. Apologists like Morris have also noted other verses in Job which seem to suggest cloud formation as the result of condensation. He bindeth up the waters in his thick clouds, and the cloud is not rent under them. And, by watering he wearieth the thick cloud, he scattereth his bright cloud. But do these passages from Job really reveal any incredible scientific insight regarding the hydrologic system, as the apologists even claim? Insights which would have been impossible for an ancient author to have had without either modern equipment or divine revelation. When we read Job 36, 27 and 28, what is this verse really saying? Is it describing the hydrologic cycle? In the King James Version, verse 27 reads that God makes the drops of water small. The Hebrew word translated for the phrase maketh small is gara, and in many instances it is used elsewhere in Scripture to mean to diminish or restrain or withdraw. For example, elsewhere in Job, he withdraweth not his eyes from the righteous. And hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? Or elsewhere, go ye, get you straw where ye can find it, yet not aught of your work shall be diminished. However, in many modern English translations of the phrase, maketh small the drops of water in Job 36:27, it is instead rendered, draw up, so that the impression is given that God is raising the drops of water, something like evaporation. In fact, the Holman Christian Standard Bible even goes so far as to actually translate the verse, He makes water drops evaporate. No such word for evaporate, however, exists in ancient Hebrew, and certainly the Hebrew gara cannot be equated with evaporation in any of these other contexts. Does God evaporate His eyes from the righteous? The verse is not describing the hydrologic cycle, but is instead stating that God makes small raindrops, and they fall as rain from the clouds. Nowhere in this verse does it state, or even imply, that the drops of water being made small are being made small from some larger body of water like the sea or a lake, and then rising into the air to form as clouds. Elsewhere in Scripture, the ancient belief that when water fell from the sky, it in fact did not return through evaporation or any other means, is made very clear. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my words be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. In addition, the verses in Job 26 and 37 suggest an ancient Hebrew belief that the clouds were like bags of water, out of which God could make raindrops and cause them to fall from the sky. This is clearly the picture being delivered in Proverbs 30, verse 4, which parallels the questions in Job regarding who but God has ascended to heaven and come down, who has gathered the wind in his fists, who has wrapped up the waters in a garment, who has established all the ends of the earth. These are hardly incredible, scientifically accurate observations. Nothing in these verses even begin to suggest cloud formation as the result of condensation. These verses picture water as being loaded into the clouds by God, not that the clouds themselves are water vapor formed through evaporation. Such questions raised in Job. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised, those wonders of him who has perfect knowledge? Are not verses of insight, but observations about the nature of clouds and lightning, which are actually puzzling to the author of Job. However, another book in the Bible does explain not only how the clouds stay aloft, but from where they rise and from where the wind comes. He makes clouds rise from the ends of the earth. He sends lightning with the rain and brings out the wind from his storehouses. So, in accordance with ancient Hebrew cosmology, clouds rise at the ends of the flat disc-shaped earth, and the winds are kept in storehouses until God calls them forth. These verses from Job and Psalms give no amazingly accurate scientific answers for how the clouds stay aloft, or for how lightning is formed, or for how the wind blows, other than to attribute these phenomena to God, exactly what one would expect from a scientifically illiterate author, not one inspired by an omniscient deity. Over 2,500 years ago, philosophers in Greece were already forming detailed, largely correct concepts of the hydrologic system. Most famously, the Ionic philosopher Anaximenes in the 6th century BCE studied meteorological phenomena and presented reasonable explanations for the formation of clouds, hail, and snow. Additionally, he formulated explanations for the cause of wind and for the rainbow. Anaxagoras in the 5th century BCE gave a most lucid concept of the hydrologic cycle. The sun rises water from the sea into the atmosphere, from where it falls as rain. Then it is collected underground and feeds the flow of rivers. In addition, he reasoned correctly that the winds were caused by differences in air density. In the 4th century BCE, Aristotle wrote the oldest and most comprehensive treatise on meteorology, in which he describes the hydrologic cycle with great precision and accuracy. Are these Greek observations any less miraculous because they occurred outside the pages of the Bible? Using the apologists' reasoning, do these remarkable scientific insights by the Greek philosophers evidence divine inspiration? Perhaps they are proof to be used for the existence of Zeus or Apollo. Or are they simply observations made by intelligent and insightful men? If such meteorological details are indeed found in Job, why is it immediately assumed that such knowledge must have come supernaturally, and not instead from human intelligence? Like other ancient peoples, the Israelites were not distracted by television, cell phones, or the internet. They could be keen observers of nature, but lacking modern scientific tools to understand the world around them, and guided by their monotheism, they attributed many natural phenomena to the workings of a supernatural being. However, apologists would have their audiences believe the ancient authors of the Bible were mentally deficient, or incredibly naive. For the apologist, the only way any accurate knowledge regarding the natural world could come to the author of the book of Job was strictly through divine revelation. But the book of Job does more than just reveal knowledge about the atmosphere and weather system of today's earth that wouldn't be confirmed until the modern era, according to some apologists. Job is also said to reveal details about the early earth's atmosphere, long before human beings ever stepped upon the land. Some apologists note that Job 38, verses 4, 8, and 9, seem to explain that the entire earth was covered with water, and that this huge worldwide ocean was itself covered by thick clouds and darkness when it was first created. The light on day one of the creation story of Genesis, then, was just that faint light one sees on a cloudy day. It was only when these clouds parted on day 4 of creation that the actual sun, moon, and stars could finally be seen as described in Genesis 1:14. Apologist Hugh Ross explains further.
Well, if you look at the book of Job, it explains what was going on at creation day 1. Notice creation day 1 says, "Let there be light." It doesn't say that God created the light. It doesn't say that God made the light. It says, "Let the light be." Well, Job 38, verse 9, God speaks and he says in the context of creation day 1, "I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness." It referring to the water that covered the whole face of the earth at that time. So whereas Genesis 1 is implicit in suggesting it's not the actual creation of the light, but the appearance of the light, notice that Job 38 is explicit. The reason why it's dark is not because of the lack of the sun, moon, and stars. It's dark because God blanketed the oceans with clouds that prevented the light from coming through. So what God did in creation day one is he transformed the atmosphere to translucent, kind of like we got today. It's overcast. You don't know where the sun is in the sky because of the clouds. And those clouds did not break until the fourth day. That's when it became transparent. As I'll explain Wednesday night, all the life that God creates before day 4 doesn't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But all the life that God creates after day 4 crucially needs to know the position of the sun, moon, and stars in order to reproduce at the right time of the year, to feed and hibernate and migrate at the right time of the year.
But this isn't at all what Job 38 is describing, nor does the creation story of Genesis 1 support this apologetic assertion. The verses here are highly poetic, describing the birth of the sea in Hebrew mythology. In the previous verses, the formation of the earth is described as the building of some great monument. Foundations are laid, pillars are sunk, and a cornerstone is placed in the construction of the structure. Following is the description of the birth of the sea as an infant, bursting forth from a womb and being caught by God and wrapped in clouds like a swaddling cloth. However, this aggressive child is shut up or hemmed in with doors, the coasts of the sea, which keep the waters from engulfing the newly formed land. Verses 10 and 11 describe this quite clearly. I placed boundaries for it, and set a bolt and doors. And I said, Thus far you shall come, but no farther, and here shall your proud waves stop. Instead of a parallel with Genesis, these opening verses of chapter 38 in the book of Job parallel the more ancient Mesopotamian creation myth, which also depicts the sea as a violent entity. Found in both the Gilgamesh and Atrahasis epics, once the gods unleashed the chaotic waters, they fled and hid, terrified of and unable to control the power of their creation. But the same is not true of Yahweh in Job. He is able to catch the ocean as a newborn, wrapping it in clouds and placing it within the boundaries of the coasts. In no sense does this Hebrew myth parallel that of modern scientific discoveries of the early Earth. Science has discovered that the oceans were formed over eons, and not in a single birth. And while the worldwide ocean did once encompass the planet, that is not the picture described in Job, where God places doors, barriers, bounds, and bars around the chaotic waters immediately following their birth. This is an ancient belief regarding the earth and its ocean as fixed and unchanging. Job states the seas were given boundaries, or coastlines, at the beginning of creation, not that they were formed and reformed over the earth's geologic history. The shorelines have changed numerous times over Earth's history. Continents have risen and fell, altering the face of the earth for billions of years. There simply are no fixed limits for the seas. As for the apologetic assertion that the light of day 1 in the book of Genesis was just a faint light, like the sunlight on a cloudy day, this too finds no parallel with modern scientific discoveries. The apologist Ross asserted that the light described in Genesis 1:2 was filtered due to clouds covering the world ocean as described in Job 38. It was only when these clouds parted on day 4 of creation that the actual sun, moon, and stars could finally be seen.
The reason why it's dark is not because of the lack of the sun, moon, and stars. It's dark because God blanketed the oceans with clouds that prevented the light from coming through. So what God did in creation day 1 is he transformed the atmosphere to translucent, kind of like we got today. It's overcast. You don't know where the sun is in the sky because of the clouds. And those clouds did not break until the fourth day.
But that isn't at all what Job 38 is describing. There is no indication in Job that this ocean was worldwide, covering the whole face of the earth. This is an apologist inventing an interpretation of the text in order to fulfill a preconceived apologetic purpose. Ross went on to state that the life prior to day 4, when the sun, moon, and stars were finally revealed as the thick blanket of clouds parted, did not need to know the position of these heavenly objects in order to survive, migrate, reproduce, etc. The life created after day 4, however, did need to see clearly the positions of these bodies in order to survive, and thus this reveals the remarkable scientific accuracy of the book of Job.
All the life that God creates before day 4 doesn't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But all the life that God creates after day 4 crucially needs to know the position of the sun, moon, and stars in order to reproduce at the right time of the year, to feed and hibernate and migrate at the right time of the year.
But the first life that shows up on the shallow coastlines of the early continents were the stromatolites. Stromatolites are structures built by blue-green algae, and since such algae needs sunlight for photosynthesis, stromatolites are restricted to shallow water in order to obtain that sunlight, not the kind filtered through clouds of thick darkness, as the book of Job puts it. Additionally, Genesis 1 states vegetation, including seed-bearing plants and fruit trees, were created before day 4, when the apologist claims only filtered sunlight reached the earth. Fruit trees and other flowering vegetation require pollination to make seeds and reproduce, and pollination requires pollinators. Pollinators can be anything from butterflies and bees and other insects to vertebrates such as hummingbirds, bears, and lizards. But Genesis doesn't mention the creation of these creatures until the 5th and 6th days. Besides, the early Earth, some 4 billion years ago, which was covered in water with a thick atmosphere, was simply inhospitable for life to have formed on its surface. If Ross's assertion was correct, and the Earth was blanketed by thick dark clouds until the first life that really required direct sunlight and the visibility of the stars in order to survive, animals created on Genesis days 5 and 6, as Ross stated, then we'd have to assume the Earth lay under these thick clouds for billions of years, as the first animals to evolve mentioned in Genesis were the fish, some 530 million years ago. Other animals mentioned in Genesis, birds and mammals, did not evolve for several hundreds of millions of years after the fish. Just how long does Ross suppose the Earth lay blanketed under that thick layer of dark clouds mentioned in Job 38? 3.5 billion years from the formation of the Earth's seas until the evolution of fish? Or 4 billion years until the evolution of mammals? Clearly, there is nothing remarkably scientifically accurate regarding the early Earth, or its atmosphere, weather, or hydrologic system revealed in the pages of the book of Job.